Well, here we discuss this very almost trivial. I remember when I first introduced this, I called it embarrassingly parallel. This was a talk I gave in 1988, and I was analyzing parallel computing. And at that time, I said 20% of the applications were embarrassingly parallel. And people found these applications were so important that somehow to give them a slightly negative context of embarrassing was not good, so they were renamed pleasingly parallel, which is the term I now use. It is these are the simplest form of parallel computing, but they're an incredibly important class of parallel computing problem. And here we have a few remarks on which we'll go into a little more detail. We'll give more examples later on in this course. Parallel computing involves organizing a set of computers to solve a problem. And when you organize them, you better make certain they're working on the same problem. You have to coordinate with them. And whenever you coordinate, you have to communicate. Remember how you get told in life, improve your communications, Jeffrey. You're not communicating well. You're making ad hoc decisions and not telling anybody. So computers aren't allowed to do that. Computers have to communicate because if we don't tell them what to do, they won't do the right thing. So organizing our computers is very important. And in the case of the simplest organization is pleasingly parallel. Each job in the sort of simplest version of this, each job starts, reads some of its own data, and then it writes it out. We're still using the single program multiple data. Each computer or process or thread is typically running the same code. It can be at different parts of the code at a given time, but they typically are doing the same thing. And but the nature of the problem is they can do that thing independently. Here's what I call local machine learning. And if I looked at, like, say, a Croesus application, there's incredibly sophisticated, it's not really usually called machine learning, it's called signal processing, takes the raw data from the radar and converts it into images which have the reflections and isolate the reflections, which enable us to determine the snow layers and the glacier beds. And so if you take, this is typical of many experimental sciences, where you take so-called, and these actually, unfortunately, using the word event again, these are experimental observations, and those observations that can, you just take lots and lots and lots of them to cover everything. The case of Croesus is because we want to cover the entire area of Greenland or the Antarctica and the Arctic. And to do that, we do that with lots and lots of separate images, each covering a small region. In the case of particle physics, we take several billion collisions each year, and each of those collisions is independent, and you need that number of collisions to be able to cover the full range of possibilities and find the rich set of things you're trying to find. It's worth noting for this LHC case that each of those events is about 1.5 megabytes. That's for the so-called CMS and ATLAS experiments. And then you have to take the raw data, which is very messy. I used to work in that field. Those are messy experiments because you're recording the particles produced in a high energy collision, and you do that by tracking these particles through various chambers, which the particles interact and record their presence, and you have to convert that recording of their presence into a measurement of the nature of the particle and at least know its charge, and also whether it's a pi meson or a k meson or a photon or an electron or what have you, or a proton. And that conversion of the raw data into a list of particles for, say, the ATLAS and CMS experiments is about 10 to 20 seconds running on a core. So you have several billion independent 10 to 20-second computations. And they're all independent, so this is a pleasingly parallel problem. Note, when you run a job for the LHC, you don't run a 10-second job. You process a file which has enough events so that the job lasts maybe an hour or so. Because setting up a job and getting it started takes time, so you have enough events there so that the startup time is small. Plus, you don't really want to write typically this field uses files. It doesn't use HBase or anything like that. It doesn't have a data management thing underneath it. And you wouldn't want one file for every event. You do not need several billion files. Actually, this problem is, of course, not really totally and pleasingly parallel, because there was one answer. There is a Higgs boson. So there are some correlated activities, and these are in the make it really of the MapReduce stack category, because it has global reductions to do histograms, to find averages for calibrations, but it's a very minor part of the computation compared to these pleasingly parallel parts. So it effectively is pleasingly parallel. Another good example of pleasing parallel, which you'll see in the classification of the use cases, is the Internet of Things, because each sensor is typically processed independently. Another class we discussed was data assimilation. So we need to bring everything to bear to solve problems, and so we need to do observational science and simulation science, or high-performance computing, computational science. And typically, we are taught to do that by solving differential equations. Differential equations have boundary conditions and initial conditions, and then you solve them. But that's not really quite correct, because that assumes you know everything. And say, even when you do something very well studied like the weather, you don't know everything. You don't really know the composition of the atmosphere perfectly. You don't know the wind velocity perfectly. So there are many uncertainties. And so, although you basically set it up as a traditional partial differential equation solver with initial and boundary conditions, you can do what's called data assimilation. You can you can take effectively redundant information, because you have a simulation, it gives you an answer, and then you compare it with the observations. But actually, you're not really trying necessarily to compare the calculation with the observation. You actually want to tell somebody what the weather is. And so the best way to tell them what the weather is to combine the data and the observation. Sorry, combine the simulation and the observation. And that's called data assimilation. The goal is to produce the best possible forecast of what's going on. So you use everything. That's the basic idea of fusion. And it's a well-known principle of big data. The way to get more understanding is to combine multiple sources of data. You look at users and products on Amazon. You don't look at just users or just products. So data assimilation is a very old technology. It's been used for a long time. I used to work on that about 20 years ago with NASA Goddard, and it's still very important. Another category, which is actually a little more recent in terms of at least its popularity, which is so-called crowdsourcing. Here, we don't actually use the computer. We may use the computer to organize things, but we use people to solve problems. A good example of where they might be useful is you have a whole bunch of images, you're searching for some hidden thing in those images. Probably people, at least historically, people are probably better than humans. People are better than computers at doing image processing. The problem is computers are faster than people. And however, so how do you solve that? You solve that by using a lot of people, the big people approach, which goes hand in hand with big data. So that's crowdsourcing. Use lots of people to correct either things that are unknown or wrong in data. So good example is the wonderful thing called Wikipedia, where people edit other people's work and correct it, and we eventually end up with a much better description of many things using this crowdsourcing strategy. There was a use case 29, which studies people for which crowdsourcing was highlighted and is very natural.